We turn to Delaware Democrat Senator Chris Coons of the Senate Appropriations and Foreign Relations Committee. Senator Coons, thanks very much. Welcome back to the NewsHour. First, on the ceasefire that was announced this afternoon by U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken. Can this hold? There, of course, have been multiple ceasefires that haven't held in the past.
Nick, I'm hopeful that this ceasefire will hold, but we need to be skeptical and continue to apply both pressure and encouragement to the leaders of these two warring factions, to General Burhan, General Hamedi, and to continue to work with the UN and our other partners in the country to organize additional convoys that will allow more folks who want to leave the country to do so safely overland.
Staying on the politics for a minute, how can the U.S. help not only ensure that the ceasefire holds, but that it becomes a genuine resumption of political negotiations to transition back to civilian rule?
Well, we've been engaging actively. Both diplomatic and military leaders from the United States have put in a series of calls to both of these two warring faction leaders. And we, over the last few years, since the Sudanese civilian population rose up and bravely overthrew the long-term dictator Omar al-Bashir in 2019, we've engaged with and supported civil society groups in Sudan. I think we need to continue to do so. We have a significant Sudanese-American joint national population in Sudan and a diaspora community here in the United States. Sudan, as you know, is a very large country, about the size of Alaska, country of 45 million people, with lots of potential, lots of agricultural and mineral wealth, and we need to do everything we can to help avert the tragedy of it descending into a civil war or a proxy war.
The U.S., of course, isn't the only actor in Sudan. Egypt backs the Sudanese military. The UAE backs Hamedi's paramilitary, as does the Russian paramilitary group, the Wagner Group. China has influence, of course, because of economic investment. As you've pointed out, is there not a problem of a lack of U.S. leverage in this moment?
Well, we have relatively limited leverage because, as I just referenced, for decades, this was a country that was on the state sponsor of terrorism list while Omar al-Bashir was the dictator of Sudan. I'll remind you, this was the country that harbored al-Qaeda, that Osama bin Laden was in, and that helped facilitate their attacks on the USS Cole, a U.S. naval vessel, attacks on U.S. embassies in both Nairobi and Dar es Salaam. Now, this was decades ago, and our hope was after the civilian overthrow of Bashir that there would be a movement towards a democratically elected government. In my last visit to Khartoum, I shared an iftar dinner with then Prime Minister Hamdok. Unfortunately, since then, there's been a military coup, and as you've been reporting, just in the last few days, the resumption of violence, of active fighting in Khartoum and across the country. We do have some leverage, both the encouragement of the possibility of robust humanitarian and development assistance and the possibility of targeted sanctions on those who might facilitate and foment further violence. So ongoing engagement by the United States, by other regional leaders, the African Union, Kenyan President Ruto, who's the leader of IGAD, a regional grouping, they can and should play a constructive and positive role.
Let's go back to the evacuation that you referenced. There's some 16,000 Americans in Sudan. That's an estimate. But today, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan pointed out U.S. drones and other military assets are flying above Sudan. U.S. warships are sailing off the coast. The U.S. is helping Americans who reach the border to travel further. But as you can see there, other countries, Italy, Spain, France, China, Saudi Arabia, among others, have all managed to figure out a way to go into Sudan and evacuate their citizens. Why can't the U.S.?
Well, none of them have evacuated anything like 16,000 people. Let's be clear. This is not a country where it is easy or safe to go in, take control of the airport in Khartoum, and fly military-scale missions to evacuate thousands of people. Each of the countries you referenced have evacuated handfuls of people. We've evacuated now, I think, something like 140 American citizens, both through the Special Forces operation to evacuate our embassy over the weekend and through the UN-led overland convoy that arrived in Port Sudan, I think earlier today, if I'm not mistaken. There will be other convoys. We are working in close partnership with the UN and other countries to make available whatever means of evacuation are reasonably possible. But there's a big difference between evacuating the Americans who work in our embassy and with USAID and providing for evacuation of thousands and thousands of people. It has never been our practice, Nick, to provide evacuation support for all citizens in a country.
Sorry to interrupt there, but do you fear the administration is too gun shy when it comes to evacuations because of the chaos of the Kabul evacuation?
Well, this is really apples and oranges, Nick. In Kabul, we had thousands and thousands of U.S. and allied military troops on the ground. We had decades of experience operating in Afghanistan, and we had an understandable moral obligation to help evacuate those who had fought alongside us in the 20 years that we were at war in Afghanistan. The situation in Sudan is fundamentally different. This is not a permissive environment. The Khartoum airport is not a military airport, and for us to secure it and be able to operate safely, regular flights out of it would take a significant insertion of American armed forces, something I certainly wouldn't recommend or support. This is a lot closer to what happened in Ukraine or in Syria or in Yemen or in Libya, where as those countries were invaded or descended into civil war, we evacuated U.S. citizens who served at our embassy and provided support for other Americans who sought to evacuate, but not through a big, large-scale, coordinated military operation.
Senator Chris Coons, Democrat of Delaware, thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick.